The dawn of the 19th century found North America in the midst of profound transformation, its future uncertain and its lands contested by powerful nations, ancient peoples, and restless newcomers. The map of the continent, so familiar to us today, was then a patchwork of claims, settlements, and shifting frontiers, a land in flux. To understand the significance of the Louisiana Purchase, it is essential to look back and see North America as it was, a meeting ground of empires, ambitions, and deep-rooted histories, all converging along the arteries of its great rivers and the boundaries of its vast, often unmapped territories. For thousands of years before Europeans ever set eyes on its forests and plains, North America was home to a rich tapestry of indigenous nations. Along the Mississippi River and its sprawling tributaries, complex societies flourished, their lives shaped by the rhythms of land and water. The river itself was more than a geographic feature. It was a lifeline, a highway, a spiritual presence. Generations of native peoples depended on the Mississippi for food, trade, travel, and communication, building vibrant cultures in the valleys and deltas along its winding path. These civilizations left their mark in mound cities, intricate trade networks, and oral histories that spoke of a world in balance with the river's ebb and flow. By the 17th century, however, the arrival of European explorers and settlers began to unravel this ancient order. Driven by dreams of wealth and empire, European powers carved up the continent according to their own ambitions, often disregarding the complex patchwork of indigenous land, sovereignty, and culture. The British staked their claim along the Atlantic seaboard, founding 13 colonies over the course of the 17th and early 18th centuries. These settlements from Massachusetts in the north to Georgia in the south would become the foundation of a new political experiment, the United States. To the north and west, France established its own foothold, exploring and settling the vast territory stretching from the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes and deep into the Mississippi Valley. French explorers, especially those who journeyed along the Mississippi, recognized the river's significance early on. They understood that whoever controlled its waters would command the heart of the continent. In 1718, the French founded New Orleans at the mouth of the Mississippi, establishing a strategic port and gateway to the interior. This settlement would soon become a linchpin in the contest for North American dominance. Spain, too, laid claim to enormous swaths of territory, pushing up from Mexico into the American Southwest and along the Gulf Coast. Spanish explorers ventured as far as the Arkansas River Valley and beyond, mapping and naming lands that, in practice, were home to numerous indigenous nations. Like the French, the Spanish recognized the Mississippi's importance, not only as a natural boundary but as a vital channel for trade, communication, and military movement. The ambitions of these European empires were as vast as the continent itself. Colonialism in North America was a complex and often brutal process. European powers sought to extract wealth, assert control, and expand their influence, often at the expense of the indigenous peoples who had lived on these lands for millennia. The arrival of new diseases, the disruption of traditional ways of life, and the pressures of war and settlement led to a dramatic decline in native populations. Yet despite these hardships, many indigenous nations adapted, resisted, and persisted, shaping the course of events in ways historians are still working to fully understand. In this era, the Mississippi River was not a boundary but a bridge, a corridor linking distant peoples and places. Its waters carried canoes laden with furs and goods, connecting the forests of the north to the markets of the south. Its meandering channels provided routes for explorers, missionaries, and soldiers. Its fertile floodplains supported agriculture and trade, drawing settlers to its banks long before the concept of the United States had entered the minds of European diplomats. By the mid-18th century, the map of North America was a study in contradiction. On paper, European powers claimed vast territories, their borders often drawn with little regard for realities on the ground. British and French ambitions collided most dramatically in the regions surrounding the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, would ultimately decide the fate of these colonies. This conflict, which raged from 1754 to 1763, pitted British and colonial forces against French troops and their indigenous allies, all vying for control of the continent's interior. The war ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, a document that redrew the boundaries of North America once again. France ceded much of its North American holdings to Britain, including Canada and all territory east of the Mississippi River, while Spain, which had allied with France late in the conflict, received the vast lands west of the Mississippi, including the territory known as Louisiana. The Mississippi itself became, for a time, a dividing line between empires, British on the east, Spanish on the west. Yet this neat division masked a far more complicated reality. as indigenous nations continued to assert their presence and as settlers, British, French, Spanish, and American pushed ever deeper into the interior. As the 18th century drew to a close, the geopolitical landscape of North America was anything but settled. The United States, newly independent after a hard-fought revolution, looked westward with a mix of hope and anxiety. The young nation's ambitions were hemmed in by foreign powers on every side. To the north lay British Canada, to the south and west, vast Spanish territories. The Mississippi River, so central to the continent's geography, became a focal point for American policymakers. Its role as the main artery of trade for the trans-Appalachian West meant that whoever controlled its mouth, particularly the port of New Orleans, controlled the economic fortunes of countless settlers. For these Americans, the Mississippi was not just a river, it was the key to their future. Farmers in Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Ohio Valley relied on the river to move their crops to market. Without access to New Orleans, their produce could not reach the world beyond the mountains. The right to navigate the Mississippi and use its ports became a matter of national concern, shaping the young nation's foreign policy and fueling a sense of destiny that would come to be known as westward expansion. Meanwhile, France's fortunes in North America had shifted dramatically. Following its defeat in the 7 Years' War, France's direct influence on the continent appeared to wane. Yet the turn of the 19th century brought new developments. In a secret treaty in 1800, France regained control of Louisiana from Spain, reclaiming a vast territory that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico northward to the Canadian border and westward to the Rocky Mountains. This transaction, largely unknown to the outside world at first, set alarm bells ringing in the United States. The prospect of a resurgent French empire on America's doorstep, one that controlled the vital Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans, was cause for concern, even alarm. Throughout this period, the Mississippi Delta region, where the river fanned out to meet the Gulf, remained a cultural crossroads. The delta's wetlands and fertile soils had long supported a diverse population, including indigenous peoples, European settlers, enslaved Africans, and free people of color. Its economic and ecological significance was recognized by all who lived there. Control of the delta meant access not only to the interior of the continent, but also to international trade routes, linking North America to markets in Europe, the Caribbean, and beyond. The evolving political boundaries of North America were mirrored in the maps of the time, though these often reflected more ambition than reality. Maps from the late 18th and early 19th centuries showed bold lines and colored blocks, each representing the territorial claims of Britain, France, Spain, and the United States. Yet on the ground, the situation was far more fluid. Settlers pressed westward into lands claimed by others. Indigenous nations defended their territories with diplomacy and force. Traders, trappers, and adventurers crossed imperial boundaries with ease or disregard, weaving a network of connections that defied simple categorization. In this complex and contested landscape, the United States faced difficult choices. Its leaders recognized that the fate of the nation was bound up with the fate of the Mississippi. Without secure access to the river and its ports, the economic growth of the Western territories, and with it, the future power of the nation, was at risk. Diplomacy became the order of the day as American envoys sought agreements and treaties to guarantee the right of navigation and passage. The country's foreign policy, shaped by the realities of its position amid powerful neighbors, aimed to avoid entanglement in European conflicts while pursuing the expansion of its own territory. This approach would later be crystallized in the Monroe Doctrine, which called for the Americas to be free from further European colonization. As the 19th century began, North America remained a stage for the ambitions of empires and nations alike. The colonial powers of Britain, France, and Spain continued to jockey for position, their fortunes rising and falling with the tides of war and diplomacy. The United States, still young and uncertain, looked to the west with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. The Mississippi River, ancient and enduring, continued to flow through the heart of the continent, bearing witness to the hopes and struggles of all who depended on its waters. The stage was thus set for a momentous turn of events, one that would forever change the map of North America. The contest for control of the Mississippi and the lands that bordered it, played out over centuries of exploration, conflict, and negotiation, was about to reach its dramatic climax. In the years to come, the Louisiana Purchase would redraw the boundaries of empire and nation, opening a new chapter in the story of a continent in flux. Thomas Jefferson paced the corridors of the president's house in the early months of his presidency, his mind fixed on the wild, uncharted lands beyond the Mississippi. To Jefferson, America's future depended on space for farmers, for communities, for generations yet unborn. He saw the West as a vast opportunity, ripe for cultivation and republican virtue, with the Mississippi River as its lifeline. Yet in 1801, that future seemed precariously balanced on the ambitions of distant monarchs. The great port city of New Orleans, gateway to the continent's interior, had slipped from Spanish to French hands in a secretive transfer. And in Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte nursed dreams of a North American empire. The map of North America might have appeared stable on parchment, but the reality was anything but. Jefferson's vision for the United States rested on the yeoman farmer and the expansion of agrarian democracy. He believed a republic could only endure if land remained available for independent farmers. The Mississippi River, vital to the commerce of the interior, was an artery without which the nation's western settlements would wither. When news reached him that France had taken possession of Louisiana, Jefferson was alarmed. He understood that French control of New Orleans threatened not only American commerce, but also the fragile unity of the country. Even a temporary closure of the port to American goods could provoke unrest or even secession among Western settlers. The stakes were enormous. France's return to Louisiana was itself a product of high diplomatic intrigue. In 1800, under the secret Third Treaty of San Ildefonso, Spain had ceded Louisiana back to France. This transfer, shrouded in secrecy, was part of Napoleon's sweeping vision to re-establish France's colonial presence in the Americas. Napoleon imagined New Orleans as a linchpin for a revived French empire, supported by the sugar-rich colony of Saint-Domingue in the Caribbean. For 2 years, the secret lingered in European courts and American diplomatic circles. When the truth finally emerged, Jefferson's administration recognized the threat at once. The presence of a powerful French regime on the nation's western border demanded urgent action. Jefferson's response was measured but determined. He turned to diplomacy, instructing his ministers to explore every avenue for securing American interests. His primary objective was simple: to guarantee American access to New Orleans and the Mississippi River. He was not, at first, seeking an empire. Instead, Jefferson authorized his envoy, Robert R. Livingston, to negotiate for the purchase of New Orleans and perhaps West Florida if possible. The United States would offer as much as $10 million for this critical strip of land. In Jefferson's mind, such a purchase would safeguard the nation's commerce and avert the dangers posed by a resurgent France. As Livingston began his diplomatic efforts in Paris, the situation remained tense. The French foreign minister, Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, proved elusive and enigmatic. Livingston's entreaties were met with vague assurances and polite deflections. It seemed that Napoleon's designs for Louisiana remained intact. Yet events across the Atlantic soon began to reshape the diplomatic landscape in ways neither Jefferson nor Napoleon could have foreseen. Napoleon's grand strategy rested on the success of his Caribbean colony, Saint-Domingue. This sugar-producing island, modern-day Haiti, was the economic engine meant to support his ambitions in Louisiana. But by 1802, the French expedition to Saint-Domingue had collapsed in failure, battered by fierce resistance from formerly enslaved people and decimated by disease. The dream of a Caribbean stronghold faded rapidly. Without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana's value to France diminished, and the territory became more liability than asset. Napoleon, ever pragmatic, began to reconsider his options. At the same time, European politics pressed in on the French leader. War with Britain loomed on the horizon, and the British Navy threatened to seize any French possessions in the Americas. Administering Louisiana from across the Atlantic, especially with British hostility, now seemed an impossible task. Napoleon needed funds for his European campaigns, and Louisiana, vast and underpopulated, was suddenly expendable. In early 1803, as tensions mounted, Jefferson dispatched James Monroe to join Livingston in Paris, hoping that a second envoy might break the diplomatic stalemate. Monroe carried instructions to negotiate for New Orleans and as much of the Floridas as could be obtained. He arrived unaware that diplomatic winds had shifted dramatically. Behind closed doors, Napoleon and his ministers had begun to discuss selling not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory. The offer, when it finally came, stunned the American negotiators. In April 1803, Talleyrand, acting on Napoleon's orders, asked Livingston an almost offhand question: "What will you give for the whole?" The Americans, prepared to haggle for a single city, were suddenly faced with the prospect of acquiring more than 800,000 square miles of land, an area that would double the size of the United States. Neither Livingston nor Monroe had explicit authority to purchase all of Louisiana, but they understood the enormity of the opportunity before them. Within days, negotiations moved swiftly. Originally, the United States had intended to purchase only New Orleans and possibly West Florida for up to $10 million. However, the scope of the negotiations expanded dramatically when France offered to sell the entire Louisiana territory. The terms settled at $15 million, a sum that included both cash and the assumption of certain French debts owed to American citizens. For less than 3 cents an acre, the United States would acquire a territory stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border and from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. The scale was unprecedented. The American negotiators moved quickly, aware that the window of opportunity might close if Napoleon changed his mind or if British forces threatened to intervene. Back in Washington, Jefferson received the news with a mixture of elation and unease. The acquisition fit perfectly with his vision of an empire of liberty, but it also posed thorny constitutional and political questions. Nowhere in the Constitution, Jefferson reasoned, was there explicit authority for the federal government to acquire new territory by treaty. As a strict constructionist, he worried about overstepping the boundaries of executive power. Yet the practical benefits were immense, and the risk of delay was too great. Jefferson ultimately decided to submit the treaty to the Senate for ratification, trusting that the national interest would prevail. The Senate debate was spirited. Some senators worried that the purchase would dilute the political power of the eastern states, dispersing the population into a vast western wilderness. Others feared the expansion of slavery into new territories. There were concerns that absorbing such a large and diverse population might strain the young republic's institutions. Yet the strategic advantages were undeniable. Control of the Mississippi River and New Orleans secured American commerce, and the acquisition promised to relieve pressure on the nation's crowded eastern seaboard. Opposition to the purchase was not limited to Congress. Among the public, some voices questioned the wisdom of expanding so rapidly, warning that the nation's energies would be scattered across too wide a frontier. Critics argued that the government was overreaching, spending vast sums on distant lands inhabited by unfamiliar peoples. Some worried that the expansion would undermine American unity or provoke conflict with both indigenous nations and European powers. Jefferson's own cabinet was divided, yet the momentum behind the purchase proved irresistible. The process of ratification and financing unfolded with remarkable speed. The Senate approved the treaty in October 1803, and arrangements were made for payment to France. The United States took formal possession of the territory in December in a series of ceremonies in New Orleans and St. Louis. American officials arrived to raise the stars and stripes over the former French and Spanish outposts, inaugurating a new era of continental expansion. Throughout the negotiations, the personalities involved left their mark on history. Jefferson's vision and caution, Livingston's persistence, Monroe's tact, and Napoleon's cold pragmatism all shaped the outcome. Talleyrand's subtle diplomacy ensured that French interests were preserved as far as possible, even in retreat. The Americans, for their part, displayed flexibility and decisiveness when the unexpected offer arose. Their willingness to seize the moment, to negotiate boldly when opportunity knocked, changed the trajectory of the nation. The Louisiana Purchase was, in many respects, a gamble. The United States acquired a territory it scarcely understood, inhabited by a patchwork of indigenous nations, French and Spanish settlers, enslaved people, and free communities of color. The challenges of governance, exploration, and integration loomed large. Yet for Jefferson, the acquisition represented the triumph of opportunity seized. He believed that the land would provide room for the Republic to grow and flourish, ensuring the survival of American ideals for generations. It is impossible to overstate the impact of those hectic months in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase marked a turning point not only in American history, but in the global balance of power. France, by relinquishing its North American ambitions, shifted its focus to Europe and the Caribbean. The British, caught off guard, found themselves facing a rapidly expanding American rival. For the young United States, the purchase sparked a wave of exploration, settlement, and conflict that would define the next century. At its heart, the story of the Louisiana Purchase is one of negotiation and opportunity, of leaders navigating uncertainty, of diplomats improvising in the face of shifting priorities, and of a nation willing to act boldly when the moment demanded it. The deal was not inevitable. It emerged from the interplay of personalities, ambitions, and historical forces, all converging in a brief window when the improbable became possible. Jefferson's vision, Napoleon's needs, and the skill of negotiators on both sides made the acquisition not just a stroke of luck, but a testament to the power of seizing the right opportunity at the right time. The road to the Louisiana Purchase was neither straight nor smooth, but it revealed, in dramatic fashion, the possibilities and perils of a nation in pursuit of its destiny. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase marked not only a dramatic expansion of territory for the young United States, but also a profound transformation in the nation's destiny and its relationship with the wider world. The sheer scale of the acquisition, over 800,000 square miles, reshaped both maps and imaginations, yet the consequences reverberated far beyond lines on parchment or the excitement in Washington's halls. They would be felt in the lives of millions, from aspiring settlers on the eastern frontier to the diverse indigenous nations who called the vast interior home, as well as in the corridors of power in Paris, London, and beyond. The financial arrangements themselves reflected the global context of the purchase. The United States had originally sought to purchase just New Orleans and perhaps West Florida for up to $10 million, but during negotiations, France offered the entire Louisiana territory. The United States agreed to pay France $15 million, a sum that, on the surface, seemed immense, but in reality amounted to less than 3 cents an acre. This deal was more than a simple transaction between two nations. It was entwined with Napoleon's broader ambitions. Facing mounting debts and the prospect of war with Britain, Napoleon saw the sale as a way to shore up French finances for campaigns in Europe. The infusion of American money helped fund his armies, while France's sudden withdrawal from North America altered the balance of power across the Atlantic. Britain, long wary of French ambitions in the New World, now faced a rapidly expanding United States instead, a reality that would shape Anglo-American relations for decades. For the United States, the purchase was a leap into the unknown. Overnight, the nation's borders stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, encompassing a bewildering diversity of landscapes, peoples, and resources. The Mississippi, already a vital artery of commerce, gained even greater importance as the gateway to the continent's interior. American control over its length and the port of New Orleans promised not just security for Western farmers, but new possibilities for trade and settlement. Yet, as the ink dried on the treaty, Americans realized that owning the land on paper was only the beginning. The true nature of their new domain remained a mystery. Its geography unmapped, its resources unmeasured, its inhabitants largely unknown to the newcomers. Into this vast, enigmatic space, President Thomas Jefferson dispatched the Corps of Discovery, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. The Lewis and Clark expedition, as it would come to be known, was far more than a journey of adventure. Jefferson's instructions were detailed and ambitious, reflecting scientific, economic, and diplomatic goals. He wanted the explorers to chart the course of the Missouri River, search for a practicable route to the Pacific, and gather information about the region's plants, animals, and geology. At the same time, their mission was to assert the United States' claim to its new lands and to establish relations, however tentative, with the many indigenous nations whose homelands they would traverse. The expedition's journey, launched in the spring of 1804, quickly became a test of endurance, ingenuity, and diplomacy. The Corps of Discovery traveled thousands of miles up the Missouri and across the Rockies, enduring extremes of weather and terrain, hunting for food, and navigating unfamiliar waters. Along the way, they encountered dozens of indigenous nations: the Mandan and Hidatsa along the upper Missouri, the Shoshone in the Rockies, the Nez Perce, and others in the Pacific Northwest. These meetings were rarely simple. They required negotiation, gift-giving, and, at times, delicate balancing between the interests of the United States and the realities of long-established indigenous sovereignty. Lewis and Clark's party depended deeply on indigenous knowledge and hospitality. Without the guidance of people like Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman who joined the expedition near present-day North Dakota, the explorers would likely have struggled to cross the daunting mountain passes or to find the resources needed to survive the journey. Their journals, filled with observations of landscapes, wildlife, and encounters, became a treasure trove of information for the nation. They documented hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to science, mapped rivers and mountain ranges, and sketched out the contours of a continent that was, for many Americans, a blank space of myth and rumor. Yet the expedition's achievements cannot be separated from their consequences for the peoples who already lived in these lands. The presence of American explorers, carrying symbols of their new government and speaking of treaties and trade, signaled a profound change. For indigenous nations, the arrival of Lewis and Clark and the wave of settlement and government action that would follow heralded a period of uncertainty, negotiation, and, ultimately, dispossession. As the expedition mapped routes and cataloged resources, it also paved the way for later waves of settlers, traders, and soldiers, each bringing new pressures on the original inhabitants. The immediate aftermath of the Louisiana Purchase saw an intensification of American efforts to extract value from the new territory. Government surveyors and land agents arrived to parcel out the land, often at the expense of those who had called it home for generations. The United States began to negotiate or, increasingly, to impose treaties with indigenous nations, seeking to purchase or, in many cases, to claim outright vast tracts of territory. These transactions were rarely equitable. Many indigenous leaders found themselves forced into agreements under duress, facing the twin threats of military action and the relentless tide of settlers hungry for land and opportunity. For indigenous communities, the consequences were profound and lasting. Land sales, forced relocations, and the erosion of political autonomy became defining features of the new order. The United States government, emboldened by its expanding borders, adopted policies that prioritized settlement and resource extraction over the rights and well-being of native peoples. The opening of the West, celebrated by many Americans as a triumph of progress, came at a steep cost for those whose histories and futures were tied to these landscapes. The process of removal and relocation, begun in the wake of the purchase, would gather momentum in the decades that followed, culminating in policies like the Indian Removal Act and the infamous Trail of Tears. The legacy of the Louisiana Purchase, then, is complex. On one hand, it stands as a symbol of American ambition and ingenuity, a moment when the nation seized an unprecedented opportunity and set itself on a course toward continental power. The expansion westward became central to American identity, fueling the rise of the doctrine known as manifest destiny. This belief that the United States was destined to span the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific gained powerful momentum from the precedent set in 1803. The purchase and the subsequent exploration of the West laid the groundwork for later territorial acquisitions from Texas to California and beyond. On the other hand, the purchase sowed the seeds of conflict and contradiction. The United States, built on ideals of liberty and self-government, now found itself grappling with the realities of governing distant and diverse populations, many of whom had no say in the treaties that determined their fate. The rapid settlement of the West fueled debates over slavery, political power, and the very character of the Republic. Each new territory added fresh complexity to the nation's already fraught relationship with the issue of slavery, setting the stage for sectional tensions that would eventually erupt into civil war. The Lewis and Clark expedition, for its part, became an enduring story of American discovery and perseverance. Their journey inspired generations of explorers, scientists, and dreamers, and their detailed records provided a foundation for understanding the continent's geography and ecology. The maps they drew, the specimens they collected, and the diplomatic overtures they made all contributed to the nation's growing sense of itself as a continental power. Yet their legacy, too, is double-edged. The opening of the West brought opportunity and hardship in equal measure, prosperity for some, and displacement for others. Globally, the Louisiana Purchase signaled a shift in the balance of power. France, by selling its North American holdings, turned its focus decisively toward Europe and the Caribbean. Britain, though relieved to see French ambitions checked, now faced a new and assertive neighbor. The United States emerged as a player on the world stage, its ability to negotiate and finance such a vast acquisition demonstrating both its ambition and its growing capacity for action. The purchase also accelerated the rise of American economic power as new lands offered resources and markets that would fuel the nation's growth for generations. In the American imagination, the Louisiana Purchase became a touchstone, a story of bold vision, fortunate timing, and the relentless pursuit of opportunity. School children learned of Jefferson's gamble, of Lewis and Clark's courage, of the opening of the West. Yet, as historians and communities have increasingly recognized, the full legacy of the purchase must also reckon with the stories of those whose worlds were transformed, often violently, in its wake. Indigenous nations whose homelands were divided and claimed without their consent have long memories of loss and resilience. The expansion of the United States brought not only new possibilities but also new injustices, many of which continue to shape the nation's conscience and its ongoing debates about land, memory, and belonging. Today, the contours of the Louisiana Purchase are visible not only in history books and museum exhibits, but in the varied landscapes of the American heartland, from the meandering course of the Missouri to the broad plains and shadowy forests that once seemed endless. The expedition routes, marked by monuments and stories, trace paths of encounter and exchange, of discovery and disruption. The rivers and portages mapped by Lewis and Clark remain vital arteries of commerce and culture. And across the region, indigenous nations endure, adapting and asserting their rights in the face of a legacy that is both a source of pain and a testament to survival. The Louisiana Purchase did not solve all the young nation's problems, nor did it fulfill all its dreams. It opened doors and set precedents, raising as many questions as it answered. Its story is one of transformation of people and land, of aspiration and consequence, of ambition and its costs. As the United States continued its march westward, the lessons and legacies of 1803 would echo through each new chapter of the nation's unfolding story. In the end, the Purchase stands as a reminder that history's great moments are rarely simple, and their consequences always reach further than anyone, president, explorer, or settler, can imagine at the time.